Edward S. Curtis, More Good Than Harm? Reconsidering the Pictorial Legacy of the Shadow Catcher. Written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. There's so much to admire about the historic American photographer, Edward Sheriff Curtis. His 30-year-long quest to document the vanishing race of native peoples west of the Mississippi has romantic and heroic overtones worthy of Don Quixote tilting at windmills on the plains of Seville. There's also a lot to criticize about this man, but most of what we don't like, his proclivity to buy into and perpetuate imperialist narratives about the inevitable disappearance of indigenous people, his refusal to accurately portray his subjects as he found them, but rather manipulate them to reflect his own cultural biases concerning their past identity, are all reflective of the times in which he lived and worked. They speak volumes about his context, but don't admit to a deeper understanding of his motives, nor holistically assess the magnitude of his accomplishments. It is too easy to simply write off Curtis as an early example of cultural appropriation. If there is something of lasting significance that comes from Curtis's titanic body of work, it may be because his motives for completing his collection evolved and ultimately transcended any desire to achieve the wealth, fame, and stature he might have initially set forth with. In fact, at the end of his life in 1952, we find Curtis divorced, impoverished, and largely forgotten. In 1907, in the foreword written for his first completed volume, Curtis wrote, "The information that is to be gathered respecting the mode of life of one of the great races of humankind must be collected at once, or the opportunity will be lost." It was this purity of motive that drove him to such towering achievement, a work comparable in ambition and scope to that of Michelangelo Buonarroti's painting of the Sistine Chapel, a titanic effort that bestowed to our present day a magical window into a world which existed before European settlement. In this pictorial record of an ancient world, translated as it is through the lens of modernity, Curtis captured what is now esteemed to be an invaluable documentation. In these photographs and films, recordings and ethnographic notes, there are woven at least as many perceptible threads of veracity as is found in the works of academic ethnographers of his day who were wont to snub him. If not for his indefatigable efforts, the reams of ethnographic details of language, dress, beliefs, artifacts of daily material life would all be lost to posterity forever. With the help of contemporary experts, both academic and indigenous, sometimes both, one can read past the distraction of the orchestrated tableau to see authentic anthropological remnants of 19th century and pre-contact indigenous life ways. It was in 1896, during an excursion to the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, to witness what was purported to be the last ever to be held Sundance of the Plains Indians, that Curtis got bit with the idea of producing a series to capture what was left of the vanishing race of Native Americans. This quest would dominate the rest of his productive working life. Curtis himself was raised on farmland in Minnesota that only a generation before had been the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people. Born in 1868 in Wisconsin, young Edward began taking pictures at the age of 12. When his father had returned from the Civil War to the Wisconsin farm, he carried with him a simple lens, which he gifted to his firstborn. In the local library, the farm boy came across a copy of pioneering American photographer Edward L. Wilson's popular magazine, The Philadelphia Photographer, which began publication in 1864. With the gift lens in hand and following the do-it-yourself instructions in the pages of the magazine, Edward fashioned his first own homemade box camera, and the rest, as they say, is history. Curtis was the oldest of four children. His father, Asahel Johnson Curtis, was a farmer and itinerant preacher. He came back from the war in poor health and perhaps suffering with the scars of psychic trauma from his combat experience. When the eldest boy was 6, Johnson moved the family to a farm in Minnesota, nearby to where his parents operated a grocery store. Edward began to pick up what extra work he could to help the family to survive, in addition to living off the land, hunting, trapping, and cutting wood. With all the poverty and hardship at home, he only managed to gain a sixth grade education. Some of Edward's fondest childhood memories revolved around traveling on the back roads and paddling by canoe upon the waterways of the recently settled frontier with his preacher father. He learned elements of bushcraft and camping, living rough in the outdoors and liking it. At that time, Curtis and his father would have encountered few, if any, indigenous people. Minnesota had achieved statehood in 1858. 4 years later, while the Civil War was raging back east, the new state experienced one of the bloodiest conflicts between settlers and indigenous people in the history of the young democracy. The events that transpired over 6 brutal weeks in the late summer of 1862 were labeled as an uprising by the settler population. The remnants of the four bands of the eastern Dakota, who had once been the caretakers of millions of acres, now had been reduced to 8,000 souls, all crowded onto a reservation on the Minnesota River that was 20 miles wide and 150 miles long. In exchange for signing treaties, they had been given farming tools and seeds and been promised annual cash payments and a regular supply of rations. Corrupt Indian agents, working in alliance with devious mercantile traders, cheated the Dakota in order to line their own pockets, with individual agents grafting as much as $100,000 in a year through selling off provisions sent by rail expressly for the people who had agreed to settle on the reservation. Andrew Myrick was a trader and operator of several stores that sold provisions to the reservation. When government payments were delayed, he refused to deliver provisions to the starving residents and was quoted as having said, "Let them eat grass." The day after the uprising began, he was among the first slaughtered. When his corpse was discovered, it was noted that his mouth was stuffed with grass. The previous year, the Dakota farmers faced crop failure due to an outbreak of cutworms in their corn, followed by an especially hard winter. The once bountiful game had been hunted and trapped out by the settlers, who were busy leveling the ancient North Woods. The promised provisions weren't delivered, and the Dakota farmers were beginning to starve. Tensions rose, and a fight broke out between four Dakota men who were hunting, who having failed to sight any game, resorted to stealing chickens from settlers. They were discovered, and a fight ensued, in which 5 settlers were killed. This was the match that lit the fuse to the powder keg that government corruption had set in place. Led by the Metawakanton chief Little Crow, whose real name was Taoyate Duta, translated as His Red Nation, a militant contingent of northern Dakota made a last-ditch effort to drive the white settlers out of their territory once and for all. The Dakota warriors were not only fighting to save the lives of their people, they were fighting to save the integrity of the land and all their wild relations, who were also being threatened by the ecological destruction of the settlers. By summer's end, 358 settlers had been killed, along with 77 regular soldiers and 36 volunteer militiamen. Thousands more were driven from their homes, and hundreds of white and mixed blood settlers were taken as captives. There is no official record of how many Dakota were killed in the conflict. On September 23rd, 1862, Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley, a man who had previously taken a Dakota wife, fathered children with her, and then subsequently abandoned this family to start another with a white woman, defeated Little Crow and his warriors at the Battle of Wood Lake. At least 150 Dakota warriors were killed. When it was over, the 53-year-old war chief and 250 of his remaining followers fled to Canada, while 350 warriors and more than 1,500 women and children were taken prisoner by the Union Army. Little Crow would be assassinated the following year upon his return to Minnesota. His father, his killer, was awarded a $500 bounty upon returning the dead chief's scalp to the state legislature. President Abraham Lincoln personally reviewed the cases of the captured Dakota combatants. Just 1 week before he was to sign the Emancipation Proclamation in what would be the largest mass execution in U.S. history, Lincoln condemned 38 Dakota men to death by public hanging. Soon after, Minnesota Governor and Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Alexander Ramsey, called for the Dakota Nation to be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. The following year, the U.S. Congress abolished the Dakota reservations in Minnesota and forcibly relocated thousands to barren lands in Nebraska. Curtis grew up with an awareness that he was raised on blood-soaked lands. As a youth, he came across a famous lithograph illustrating the infamous public hanging of the 38 Dakota men in the town of Mankato on December 23rd, 1862. The image made a lasting impression upon him. In 1885, young Edward was hired as an apprentice photographer in St. Paul. The following year, when he turned 17, the Curtis family moved to the Olympic Peninsula region of Washington State. Edward and his father went first and built a cabin in preparation for the rest of the family, who had remained behind in Minnesota until all was ready. 3 days after their arrival to the new homestead, the Reverend Asha L. Curtis died of pneumonia, leaving his eldest son responsible for the care of his mother, Ellen, and two younger siblings. The next eldest, Ralph, remained in Minnesota. Edward used his knowledge of bushcraft to hunt and trap, dig for clams, and fish during the still abundant salmon runs. He worked for a time as a logger, but the year he turned 19, he suffered a serious accident while rafting logs on a river and was laid up in the cabin for close to a year, healing his fractured lumbar spine. This forced convalescence was a period in which he developed a more subtle appreciation for the nuances of changing light and atmosphere, as he spent long hours contemplating the scenes from his bedroom window. He later wrote of discovering how in a single dewdrop on the leaf of a rhododendron, one could observe an infinity of prismatic rainbows. When he was well enough to be up and about again, Edward Curtis vowed he would never risk life and limb as a manual laborer again. Much to the consternation of his family, he spent $150 on a box camera, $5,249 in 2024 dollars, and soon after set out to the city of Seattle to make his fortune. Accompanying him on the short nautical voyage across Puget Sound was his soon-to-be wife, 16-year-old Claire Phillips, a neighbor whom his mother had hired to help in the home during Edward's protracted bed rest. Claire was from a good home and was raised with a taste for the finer things in life. She was intelligent and well-read in Shakespeare and the classics. Next, the upwardly mobile Curtis mortgaged the family homestead to come up with another $150 investment in order to become a partner in a local photography studio. Within 6 months, he sold this share and joined forces with another photographer, Thomas Guptill, to establish a new studio, Curtis and Guptill, photographers and photo engravers. From that humble beginning, Curtis quickly built a successful career. Very soon, he had a wife and a growing family and a thriving business as a photographer of the nouveau riche. The studio was an impressive edifice with ample gallery space. This time, Seattle was a rising port city. With a population of over 80,000 in 1900, it was second only to San Francisco as the largest city on the West Coast. This growth was catalyzed in part by Seattle serving as the launching pad for the thousands of adventurers heading north to seek their fortunes in the goldfields of Alaska. The outdoorsman in Curtis chafed at being locked inside the studio taking portraits of the social elites. He was fond of getting out for long walks to the shore. One day, he chanced upon an indigenous woman digging clams. In former times, this would have been a ubiquitous sight, but now the town fathers had banned indigenous people from entering city limits. This clam digger was the lone exception. Her name, itself an ironic denomination, was Princess Angeline, the last surviving child of the famed Suquamish leader Chief Seattle, after whom the city was named. In modern times, Chief Seattle is renowned for the transcription of a speech he was purported to have delivered to the territorial governor of Washington in 1854, a withering condemnation of the environmental ignorance of the white race, which concluded with the prophecy, "Only when the last tree has died, and the last river has been poisoned, and the last fish has been caught, will you realize that you cannot eat your money." Now over 90 years old and a well-known local character, Princess Angeline, whose native name was Kikisomio, was granted an exception to the ban passed by the city council that forbade indigenous people from entering the city that bore the name of her father. She lived in a hovel on the outskirts and made a meager living selling clams and native crafts. She was reputed to go about with her pockets loaded with stones to throw back at the gangs of boys, who often heckled and threw stones at her. It was not that long ago that Curtis himself had been digging clams to feed his family. Now he got the notion that he should like to make a portrait of this indigenous clam digger, but she desisted his requests for some time. He finally wore her down and got her into the studio for a sitting, for which he paid her the no small sum of $1 silver. He took two more photos of her at work. In 1896, he submitted these two images, the mussel gatherer and the clam digger, along with a third titled Homeward, which depicted Puget Sound, to a juried exhibition sponsored by the National Photographic Association. The photo of the Sound garnered him a grand prize and a gold medal. Curtis garnered such positive notoriety for this series that the following year, the portrait of Angeline was displayed at the Louvre in Paris. This first experience of taking note of and photographing an indigenous person bears many traits that would become hallmarks of his later work. A subject and who in real life is relegated to a life of poverty, condescension, and the torment of mockery, sits before the viewer with defiant and regal dignity. Her gaze and the set of her face yield nothing to the viewer save resolute defiance. This man was singular in his ability to gain enough of her confidence to execute his craft and produce what might be considered his first masterpiece of indigenous portraiture. As his success with the studio increased, so did the yearning and restlessness in the soul of the young businessman photographer. He began venturing out on more serious forays to take photographs of the surrounding countryside, including a series of images capturing the many moods of majestic Mount Rainier. Getting these shots involved alpine trekking with camping supplies and a camera weighing 60 pounds. On one such foray, he happened upon two lost hikers who had become separated from their party. By now, Curtis knew the mountain like the back of his hand and safely returned the adventurers to their camp, the camp of their companions. This chance encounter would alter the course of the charismatic young photographer's life, as the fellows he had rescued were none other than the world-famous naturalist, ethnographer, and founder of the Audubon Society, George Bird Grinnell, and the first director of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. The party was on Rainier as part of an exploratory survey to determine whether the mountain should be added to the new national park system. Grinnell was so impressed with his rescuer that he used his influence to have him appointed the official photographer of the 2-month-long 1899 National Geographic expedition to Alaska, sponsored by the wealthy business tycoon Edward H. Harriman. Curtis soaked up the lectures on ethnography that were given aboard ship in the evenings. He was, in turn, appalled by the unscrupulous disrespect shown to indigenous cultures, such as when he observed artifacts of totem poles and carvings stolen from villages whose occupants were temporarily away at summer fishing camps. Grinnell was delighted with Curtis's work, and the following year, he was invited to accompany him on a trip to Montana to make a visual record of what was ostensibly to be the last ever Sundance ceremony of the pagan band of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika. By this time, Grinnell was considered to be among the foremost experts on Native American culture. He had visited the Blackfoot Reservation numerous times. The tribal members had given him the appellation Bird because of his habit of appearing in the summer months and disappearing again when the brutal plains winter encroached. The sun dance and other indigenous ceremonies had been officially banned under the 1883 Code of Indian Offenses issued by the federal government as part of a wider effort to dismantle traditional life ways and force assimilation into white culture. This trip proved to be the pivotal moment when Curtis experienced an epiphany of sorts, and the grand scheme of producing a comprehensive visual catalog of the remaining Native American cultures took firm root in his soul. Meanwhile, the photography business in Seattle was chugging along. By 1900, Edward had been joined by his younger brother, Asahel. The brothers would later have an irrevocable falling out when the elder Curtis took publishing credits for photographs Asahel made during a 2-year foray to the goldfields of Alaska. With his wife Clara and his brother managing affairs at home, Curtis embarked on his first photographic expeditions into Indian country and began taking portraits of indigenous people in earnest. He created a nook in the studio where his photographs of native people were on display, along with artifacts he'd begun to collect during his expeditions. In November of 1903, the legendary Chief Joseph came to Curtis's studio to sit for his portrait. Thunder rolls down the mountain, as the leader of the Loa band of Nez Perce was known by his own people, had come to Seattle to meet with government agents, once again seeking just restitution for all the broken treaties that had left his once proud nation of renowned horsemen stranded and abjectly poor on tiny reservations. In response, the city fathers brought him to the stadium to watch a football game. Almost 100 years before, in 1805, and again in 1806, the Nez Perce had welcomed the ragtag Corps of Discovery, led by U.S. captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who were suffering in the extremes of hardship and on the brink of starvation. Both times, on their way in search of the Pacific and on their return, the white intruders were welcomed as friends and generously provisioned so that they could continue on their journey, prompting Lewis to record in his journal, "The Nez Perce tribe greeted us with open arms and showed us great hospitality, proving that not all Native American tribes were hostile towards outsiders." In all the ensuing decades, the Nez Perce had not once made war against the Americans. In their final 1,170-mile gamut for freedom, which took them across the territories of 4 states, and which was thwarted by General Miles Nelson within 1 mile of the Canadian border, Chief Joseph's brilliance did not lay in aggressive military action, but rather in skillful tactics of evasion. The legendary chief had his portrait taken on many occasions, but no one captured his image with the veracity and poignancy that Curtis mustered. The chief was said to be very fond of the photographer and considered him a friend. Joseph died the following year at the age of 64. The doctor assigned to attend the reservation said that the cause of death was heartbreak. In that same year of 1903, at the urging of Clara, Curtis entered a national photography contest sponsored by the Ladies' Home Journal in search of the prettiest children in America. He submitted a portrait of the young daughter of a prominent local family, and the image garnered a second-place runner-up position. Edith Caro Roosevelt, the second wife of President Teddy Roosevelt, was favorably struck with the photo. On the strength of this work, Curtis was hired to photograph the Roosevelt's family in their home on Long Island Sound. While in this employ, he was befriended by TR and the family, and even convinced the great man to sit for a portrait. Roosevelt deemed the picture to be his best likeness. Leading historians rate the image as the most honest, accurate, and brilliantly produced photograph ever taken of the 26th president. After the completion of his commission with the Roosevelts, TR endorsed Curtis to the business tycoon J.P. Morgan. Although Roosevelt assured Curtis that his endorsement held little sway, given that due to his reputation as a trust buster, he was reviled and considered a class traitor by his fellow aristocrats. Even so, Morgan did concede to back the photographic enterprise, eventually to the tune of $75,000, a whopping $1.9 million in today's currency. The impatient businessman had been ready to dismiss this motley nuisance, having only agreed to meet the young dandy as a courtesy. But when Curtis insisted that Morgan view his portfolio, one image called out to him and struck a nerve. It was the portrait of a Mojave girl named Mosa, whose haunting gaze was at once innocent and yet replete with an ancient sagacity that somehow touched the irascible entrepreneur. In addition to all the fine art he had acquired, Morgan fancied himself a book collector. Now he conceived of publishing the finest set of volumes the world had ever known. Ironically, Morgan had made his first fortune in buying up and consolidating the transnational railroads that had hastened the demise of the Plains Indians. Roosevelt was also a controversial and flawed character of heroic proportions. He too, having spent formative years in the Dakota Territories, admired indigenous people, and yet his administration oversaw cruel policies of assimilation. Teddy set aside national parks to preserve the natural wonders of the continent, yet in many cases, this involved further relocation of indigenous people, as with Yosemite in California, where Roosevelt and John Muir oversaw the displacement of the Miwok people, whose ancestors had lived in the valley for 7,000 years in the course of establishing the new park. Meanwhile, rapacious capitalists like Morgan, men of the age of robber barons, were busy building more railroads, leveling forests, digging mines, drilling for oil, and pillaging the continent with resource extraction at an alarming speed. Yet Morgan and others of his ilk essentially paid Curtis to document an image of Indians that showed them as a people who were at one with nature. These business elites were perceived as men leading sophisticated, complicated lives consisting of commercial pursuits and urban settings. By contrast, Native Americans were perceived as an embodiment of their own primitive ancestors. By intertwining the lives of Native Americans so closely with nature, Curtis purposefully highlighted this perception of cultural distance between viewer and subject. By refusing to record the people just as he found them, Curtis undergirded the narrative of manifest destiny that held that the disappearance of the noble savage was inevitable. Over the course of his 30-year quest, Curtis produced 40,000 photographs, hundreds of hours of film, and made 10,000 wax cylinder recordings of language and music, using the process developed by Thomas Edison in 1888. Only 276 of the original recordings survive, but almost all were transcribed. Despite at first being snubbed by ethnographers and anthropologists and other experts residing at the Smithsonian, Curtis filled his books with detailed ethnographic notes about beliefs and practices of the more than 80 tribes that he spent time with, representing the most extensive anthropological record ever assembled before or since. Through the recordings and field notes, Curtis's team recorded information from primary source fonts concerning tribal mythologies and history, traditional foods, dwellings, games, ceremonies, burial custom, clothing, and biographical sketches. From 1903 onward, when he made his first foray into Hopi land in Arizona, Curtis would go for at least 6 months every year with a team to a specific indigenous sites and would spend as much as 6 to 10 weeks just abiding and helping out before asking to take a photograph. He had been mentored well by Grinnell during their 1889 trip to observe the crow sun dancers. Grinnell had spent multiple decades sojourning among the tribes of the Great Plains. Byrd had advised the impetuous young man to leave haste behind if he wanted to get ahead with these people. In those early days, Clara and the children sometimes accompanied Curtis on these excursions. Although the youngsters were delighted with the adventures of camp life, their mother was not very amenable to roughing it, nor did she share her husband's nearly unqualified trust in the goodwill of the Indians. On one such trip to Navajo country, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. Soon after their arrival, a child was stillborn on the reservation. Relatives of the forsaken family began to whisper that the witchcraft of the Anglos was the likely cause. Curtis was warned in the middle of the night of the danger. He immediately packed up camp and moved out of the vicinity. Clara and the children beat a hasty return to Seattle, and that was her last foray into the field. With the endorsement of Morgan, Curtis was able to assemble a team of experts to assist in field work, post-production, and development of plates, and the transcription and editing of ethnographic recordings. Often, the team had to travel by horseback and wagon to reach the remote outposts on reservations. The initial team included the journalist William E. Myers, who assisted in writing and recording indigenous languages, University of Washington graduate Bill Phillips for help with logistics and fieldwork, Frederick W. Hodge, an anthropologist from the Smithsonian, and the indispensable Alexander B. Upshaw, a member of the Apsaalooke Crow tribe who served Curtis as an ambassador and translator in his work among the tribes of the Great Plains. A.B. Upshaw had been taken from his home by federal agents while still a young teenager and placed in the Carlisle Indian Boarding School for the Industrial Arts in Pennsylvania. The government-backed institution was founded in 1879 by cavalry captain Richard Henry Pratt, whose official motto was, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Here young Alexander's braids were cut, and he was dressed in a school uniform. He was forced to abandon his spiritual beliefs and practices, adopt Christianity, and only ever speak in English. Students were underfed, received shoddy medical treatment, and were regularly beaten, as well as subject to psychological and sexual abuse. The quick-witted and highly intelligent Upshaw made the best of his new situation. He proved to be an exceptional student and was an avid member of the debate team. Upon graduation, he submitted a composition to the school newspaper, extolling all the great gifts of modernity the white race had brought to the Indian, concluding, "Unless we break away from our tribal relations and go out into the world as men and women, we will remain Indians and perish as Indians." He extended his academic studies for another 2 years through a scholarship to nearby Bloomberg University. Once he returned to the reservation, Upshaw and others of his fellow boarding school graduates began to use their knowledge of the ways of the white men to help their people deal with government bureaucracy. Although Upshaw was hired by the federal government as a surveyor of the reservation in preparation for implementing a policy of allocating individual allotments aimed at breaking up tribal lands, once the allotments were granted, the remaining reservation land would be sold off to whites. He simultaneously used his knowledge to help the Crow Nation strengthen its unity through effective political organization, and they were thus better positioned to resist federal government attempts to push through the plan. In 1898, Upshaw got the opportunity to work for the photographer Frank Reinhardt, who was covering the National Indian Congress in Omaha, Nebraska. Here he would have met indigenous leaders from every corner of the nation. When his work at the Congress was complete, he took a job teaching at the Genoa boarding school near Omaha. While engaged in that employ, he fell in love with Emma Young Mart, a divorced white woman 10 years his senior with three teenage children, who was working as a laundress at the school. They were married in 1899, and the following year moved back to the Crow Reservation in Montana. On the strength of his work with Reinhardt, Upshaw was recommended to Curtis, who hired him on and found him to be one of the most remarkable men I ever saw. Upshaw served not only as an arranger and translator, he did much of the recording of field notes and wrote up the finished versions of text. Upshaw worked for Curtis for 6 years and was instrumental in completing the portions of the volumes that covered his own people, the Crow, as well as the Sioux, Arikara, and Blackfoot nations. In 1905 and again in 1907, Curtis traveled to the site of Custer's last stand at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Wyoming, known to the Lakota as the Battle of the Greasy Grass. He was accompanied on these excursions by Upshaw and three other Crow men who had been employed as scouts for the 7th Cavalry. Up until then, no indigenous accounts of July 7th, 1876 had been recorded. The Crow were sworn enemies of the Lakota. Their alliance with the Bluecoats was on the basis of this long-standing enmity. Under the guidance of the former Crow Scouts, Curtis reconstructed the events of the day, meticulously recording and photographing troop movements in the exact spots where skirmishes transpired. He concluded that the official stories promulgated about the events were false, and that General George Armstrong Custer had unnecessarily sacrificed the lives of his soldiers to further his personal ends. He published his preliminary findings by way of an interview appearing in a single New York Times article. This new information proved so controversial and unpopular. Military brass and President Roosevelt himself counseled Curtis to desist, and Libby Custer, the widow and principal defender of her hero husband's legacy, threatened a lawsuit. But Curtis only made the briefest mention of the findings in his printed work. The full 57-page report on the battle was buried and only came to light in the early 2000s. It has proved to be a revelatory trove for contemporary historians. The circumstances of Alexander Upshaw's untimely death are murky. In the months leading up to the tragedy, he assumed more of a leadership role, including a trip to Washington, D.C., where he had the opportunity to speak directly with President Roosevelt about the conditions of deprivation on the Crow Reservation. Upon his return, Upshaw managed to secure government patent funds that allowed him to purchase and protect 1,000 acres of Crow land, acreage that was rapidly being bought up by speculators, thereby turning the tables on his adversaries by using the capitalist system to the advantage of the Red Nation. As an Indian who had a growing reputation as one who fought hard on behalf of his people, and one who had the audacity to marry a white woman, Alexander B. Upshaw had become a marked man. On the evening of October 19th, 1909, Upshaw was provoked into a verbal altercation with a group of white men on the streets of Billings. The next morning, he was found dead in a jail cell, determined to have died from self-inflicted wounds resulting from overconsumption of alcohol. The coroner in the case did not even physically examine him, but only made his pronouncement based on speculation upon viewing the beaten and bloodied corpse of the victim from outside the bars of the cell. A.B. Upshaw was 38 years old at the time of his death. Curtis gave credit to Upshaw four times in the North American Indian, in volumes 3, 4, and 5. He credited Upshaw as his interpreter during his fieldwork in Montana and North Dakota. In volume 7, he announced Upshaw's passing, saying, "It is with profound sorrow that the author announces the death, in the autumn of 1909, of Mr. A.B. Upshaw, his Crow interpreter and informant, whose assistance in collecting the material for volumes 3, 4, and 5 was of such inestimable value." The first volume of the North American Indian was available for sale in 1910. The artistry of the images notwithstanding, the physical books themselves were exquisite. They were printed on handmade Japanese paper, printed with the highest quality inks, and bound in hand-tooled Moroccan leather. Each edition contained approximately 75 images and 200 pages of text. The cost to subscribe in advance for a complete set of all 20 volumes was $3,000, about $77,000 today. A deluxe edition sold for $3,800. Curtis had pinned his hopes on selling subscriptions to the entire set, but after the economic downturn of 1907, the disposable income of the well-to-do shrank drastically, and subscription sales were a disappointment. Teddy Roosevelt was one of a handful of full subscribers. He sold an initial 145 subscriptions, but of these, many of the subscribers partially reneged and would only pay for each volume as they became available. If he were to keep going, he was going to have to generate alternative revenue streams. By 1910, Curtis was working in the Pacific Northwest region, where he conceived of producing a feature-length film. He had begun making short ethnographic films as far back as 1906, but nothing as ambitious as the current project, which he hoped would be a moneymaker at the box office to fund his ongoing book project. In the Land of the Headhunters debuted on December 7th, 1914, in theaters in New York City and Seattle. It was the first feature-length film with a cast comprised entirely of indigenous people. Curtis worked with the Kwakiutl tribe of British Columbia. The people of the Pacific Northwest challenged the golden rule of ethnologists that had held that stratified societies with complex hierarchies only exist in civilizations that have developed sedentary agriculture. The region was so abundant with food sources from the forest and from the sea that the people were able to live in permanent towns in cedar plank wooden houses. This culture of abundance gave rise to the potlatch ceremony, documented by Curtis in the film, where wealth was not measured by how much one accumulated, but rather by how much one could give away. Although critics praised the film, it was a financial failure. From an ethnographic standpoint, it was esteemed for the details of ceremony, hunting, and boatmanship that are recorded. But Curtis was criticized for having fabricated many of the costumes and artifacts used as props and for creating unrealistic characters and an implausible plotline. Along with the sorry financial outcome, Curtis also came away from this enterprise with a bad limp, the result of a hip injury he sustained when the boat he was using to direct scenes out on the water was bumped by a breaching whale. During this same time period, Curtis continued to develop his skills and range as a multimedia artist. He conceived of another grand project he hoped would earn revenue for his enterprise. This time it was a magic lantern picture show featuring exquisite hand-tinted slides that could be projected onto a big screen via a stereopticon projector. The show was narrated by Curtis and accompanied by a small orchestra with original music from the team of composers of Gilbert and Sullivan. By all accounts, the Indian picture opera was well received, filling theaters and auditoriums across the country during its two-season run between 1911 and 1913. However, the operating costs exceeded ticket sales, and his financial backers pulled out after the second year of the tour. End of part one.